During the 1950s and 60s, the United States was going through a turbulent time period. Civil rights, political assassinations, and the Vietnam War combined to make this time period an era of change and conflict. There were many politicians and activists that worked hard together to bring about the societal changes they supported, and some had conflicts because they did not agree on the most important issues of that time period. Robert F. Kennedy, through many trials and tribulations, took a stand for equality and basic human rights to ensure that all men are created equal. Robert Kennedy, also well known as Bobby, experienced situations and circumstances that made him evolve on such issues. His new views played a prominent role in his 1968 campaign for the presidency. Leading up to and including the 1960s, African Americans faced struggles on all fronts. In 1959, 22% of the overall population was in poverty. At the same time, African American poverty was at 57%. Segregation was the biggest problem for American society during this time period. African Americans lived under segregation laws and dealt with instances of extreme violence and terrorism toward their communities. Robert Francis Kennedy was born on November 20th, 1925, to Mr. and Mrs. John and Rose Kennedy in Brooklyn, Massachusetts. "I was the seventh of 9 children," he later recalled, "and when you come from that far down, you have to struggle to survive." Raised as devoted Roman Catholics, he and his siblings enjoyed a life of wealth and privilege. From a very young age, Bobby was interested in politics. "I can hardly remember a mealtime," Robert Kennedy said, "when the conversation was not dominated by what Franklin D. Roosevelt was doing or what was happening in the world." Bobby attended Milton Academy, graduated, then attended Harvard University in Cambridge. During World War II, his older brother Joseph died. During the same time, Kennedy left Harvard and joined the Navy. In 1946, Bobby ended up returning to Harvard and graduated with a degree in government in 1948. Bobby spent the next 3 years attending the Virginia School of Law, pursuing a law degree. During this time, Kennedy met and quickly fell in love with his sister's roommate, Ethel Skakel, whom he married. In 1951, he graduated from law school and passed his bar exam. Straight out of law school, Kennedy practiced law in Washington, D.C., working as a special correspondent for the Boston Post, and got to travel to Palestine, Lebanon, Turkey, Greece, and Italy. Bobby Kennedy's brother, John F. Kennedy, was elected President of the United States in 1960. JFK appointed his brother as Attorney General. He quickly became one of JFK's closest cabinet members. While JFK wanted to focus his presidency on issues related to the Cold War, domestic events forced JFK and Bobby Kennedy to confront issues and events related to the African American Civil Rights Movement. The Civil Rights Movement would be a test of Attorney General Kennedy's values and will. Kennedy did not always rise to the occasion to take an immediate stand for equality and human rights. In May of 1961, when a hostile mob threatened freedom riders at a church in Birmingham, Alabama, Kennedy threatened to deploy U.S. Marshals, ensuring that the riders were able to continue their historic journey unhurt. In response to the Freedom Riders, in September of that year, Robert orders the Interstate Commerce Commission to end segregation in interstate bus terminals. However, Kennedy faced criticism for telling civil rights leaders that they should take a break from actions that would instigate further violence, and that the leaders should focus their attention on getting legislation passed. As civil rights events continued to arise, Bobby Kennedy started to realize that civil rights needed to be addressed and that the Cold War was not the only issue that needed to be dealt with. On August 22, 1964, just 9 months after John died, he resigned from his role as the U.S. Attorney General and decided to run for the Senator of New York, successfully accomplishing his goal and winning. With a huge margin over the Republican candidate Kenneth Keating, he took a stand for the poor, human rights, and racial discrimination. One of his biggest accomplishments was when he was senator. People challenged Kennedy, instead of just speaking out about the issues that were going on, actually taking action. Kennedy visited Bedford-Stuyvesant, which helps amid poverty and riots. Kennedy felt moved and inspired, so he helped create community development corporations, which are still around today. Not only did Bobby Kennedy spend a lot of his time as a senator studying issues of poverty and human rights in the United States, he also expanded that reach to different places around the world. During his time as a senator, Kennedy traveled to Eastern Europe, Latin America, and South Africa. He used these trips to share his beliefs that all people have a basic human right to participate in their government and live a life free of government oppression. On June 6, 1966, at the University of Cape Town, during the height of the apartheid Bobby delivered what many people consider the greatest speech of his life, called A Ripple of Hope. He went to South Africa to speak out for the equality and human rights of the people in South Africa that were being negatively affected by the government policy of apartheid. Acts of courage and belief that human history is shaped. Each time a man stands up for an ideal or acts to improve the lot of others or strikes out against injustice, he sends forth a tiny ripple of hope. On human rights, Bobby said this: "We must recognize the full human equality of all of our people before God, before the law, and in the councils of government. We must do this, not because it is economically advantageous, although it is, not because of the laws of God command it, although they do, not because people in our lands wish it so. We must do it for the single and fundamental reason that it is the right thing to do." As the 60s continued to progress, Kennedy dove headfirst into the different civil rights movements that were going on. In 1968, Bobby was in full support of the movement to gain Latino farm workers' rights and joined Cesar Chavez and the United Farm Workers Association on their march from Delano to Sacramento. Although Bobby Kennedy became a leader for human rights in the United States and around the world, he isn't without his faults. Throughout history, Kennedy received lots of criticism for some of his actions against Martin Luther King Jr. In 1963, with much added pressure from the director of Federal Bureau of Investigations, J. Edgar Hoover, Bobby approved the FBI to wiretap Dr. King's phone due to several allegations of him speaking to many communist leaders. This action is one that haunted Bobby for the rest of his life and kept occurring during his run for the United States Senate in 1964 and for the presidency in 1968. In March 1968, viewed as his brother's political heir, Kennedy decided to run for president after Senator Eugene McCarthy's upset primary election victory in New Hampshire. His campaign brought on both great enthusiasm and fear in the citizens. Many viewed his run as selfless. When he announced his candidacy, he said,
"I am announcing today my candidacy for the presidency of the United States. I do not run for the presidency merely to oppose any man, but to propose new policies. I run because I am convinced that this country is on a perilous course, and because I have such strong feelings about what must be done, and I feel that I'm obliged to do all that I can. I run to seek new policies to end the bloodshed in Vietnam and in our cities, policies to close the gaps that now exist between black and white, between rich and poor, between young and old, in this country and around the rest of the world. I run for the presidency because I want the Democratic Party and the United States of America to stand for hope instead of despair, for reconciliation of men instead of the growing risk of world war. I run because it is now unmistakably clear that we can change these disastrous, divisive policies only by changing the men who are now making them.
Kennedy soon became a force to be reckoned with. On May 7th, he won the Indiana primary, and on May 14th, he won the Nebraska primary, but unfortunately lost the Oregon primary on May 28th to McCarthy. On June 5th, 1968, after winning the most important primary in California and knocking McCarthy out of the race, he addressed his supporters at midnight in Los Angeles at the Hotel Ambassador in a ballroom. Shortly after finishing his speech, he went through the hotel kitchen after being told it was a shortcut to the press room. Unfortunately, Sirhan Sirhan, a 24-year-old Palestinian, opened fire with a .22 caliber revolver and hit the senator. He was rushed to Good Samaritan Hospital, where he died the next morning. The 1960s was a very hard time for the United States. With the loss of many civil rights activists, such as Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert F. Kennedy, it was a very unbearable and dark era. As America started to move on into a new time period, no one would ever forget about the stand he took in history. Whether that meant helping Cesar Chavez and immigrants get basic human rights in the fields, or giving one of the best speeches in the middle of apartheid in South Africa. No matter what, Robert F. Kennedy will always be a hero and leader in the eyes of all American people.